This is a very, very important work session for us. We are grateful for, just the many emails that we've received and phone calls. We're grateful for those who, by participating in protests and marches, also, let their concerns be shared, but more importantly, to let their priorities be known. As we mentioned, we are in the process of listening and learning, both from our community to say, to see what should, community policing look like, what should community public safety be like for the city of Hillsboro. Part of this process is to listen to our chief, to be able to hear this report about policing in the city of Hillsboro and asking questions. Many of these questions will be those that have been forwarded to us, via email. And so we are, again, grateful to the communications that we've received. We're also grateful, again, for the opportunity to hear from our police chief. And Chief Coleman, thank you to you and all of your department. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say. A reminder to council, I know that there will be questions, but please just, if there are questions that come up during the presentation, just jot them down and we will ask the chief and other presenters the questions at the conclusion of his report. So with that, I will turn it over to Simone Brooks, who will then take us to Chief Coleman.
Thank you, Mayor. Tonight, we are receiving a very timely work session as evidenced by the level of community involvement and voice that we've heard to the mayor's point. So tonight, the work session is about the City of Hillsboro Police Department's policies. I know council is eager to hear this work session, so I will hand it off to Chief Jim Coleman. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, members of the council, and thank you, Simone. This is an important time in the history of our nation and our community. I have a small team of employees from the police department here with me tonight. They're going to help with the presentation to the council and field council questions in the end. Our intention is to present concise information, but be informative so it can help direct your questions, give you insights into some of the efforts of the police department and some of the aspirations of the police department. At this time, I'd also like to take a moment and just speak from my heart and deliver a personal statement. I, like the members of the council and the mayor and many employees from the city of Hillsboro, have received letters, emails, and phone calls, and they contain many truths for each of those individuals. And I want to share with you tonight my truths. George Floyd was murdered. Racism is historic, malignant, and deadly. Change cannot wait. Hillsboro police officers make this community better. Thank you. The policies which we're here to speak about tonight are not new. They're not exclusive to any single organization, and they're not static. They're referred to by many different names, such as Campaign Zero's 8 Can't Wait, or in the case of the Hillsboro Police Department, Policy 301, General Force Response. They have, in several circumstances, evolved over the last decade through case law, independent scientific analysis, legislation. Sorry for that. Legislation and training. It would be most correct to inform you that the Hillsboro Police Department agrees with the general principle of 8 Can't Wait. It has evolved from certain aspects of it through deliberative processes and has seen the need to directly address areas of vagueness and careful reconsideration in the light of recent events. Police use of force or force response is not simply a mechanical sequence. As previously noted, it is a result of several processes. However, it is also the product of attitude and culture. In fact, I personally believe that attitude and culture are major drivers in police excessive use of force. Because of this, I think it is crucial to our conversation that I briefly illustrate where the Hillsboro Police Department is and aspires to be on attitude and culture. The President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, released in 2015, contains over 150 recommendations and action items. Full adoption is neither practical nor the intention of the report. One of the most useful aspects of the report is to put into words and meaning the larger ideals such as community policing. The ideal of procedurally just practices is central to HPD's efforts. Procedurally just behavior is based on 4 central principles: treating people with dignity and respect, giving individuals voice during encounters, being neutral and transparent in decision-making, conveying trustworthy motives. Next slide, please. Efforts to earn the community's trust include having a specific policy addressing unbiased policing backed up by training. In the previous 3 years, 82% of officers have received crisis intervention training that emphasizes de-escalation in concert with dignity and respect towards disadvantaged individuals. And over the last 2 years, a body-worn camera system was implemented for all first responders to promote accountability and transparency. This was accomplished with the council's assistance and done well in advance of any legislative mandate. The Hillsboro Police Department accepts all complaints on personnel regardless of how they are received, to include those received anonymously. The department is in compliance with required bias policing complaint reporting. It is spearheading an effort to create an electronic portal that removes signature and addressing information on complaints submitted online and anonymously. And I am happy to report tonight that that system is up and running. The department has long delivered de-escalation training in its precursors to officers. As part of their 64 hours of annual training, which is at least double that required of the state of Oregon. We also incorporate diversification of our personnel. The police department is particularly outstanding in the number of women it has and the number of women in leadership positions. But we also have diversified across several ethnic and racial categories. We have officers that speak up to 16 different languages. And most recently, in the previous years, diversification of the police department has reached levels of approximately 20% of those individuals that we hire. There is still great progress to be made, but that is progress which I hope can remain intact in the current environment. The department listens to and incorporates council input in a timely fashion. There are multiple noteworthy examples in just the last 4 months, to include the launching of a pilot project to increase outreach to historically underrepresented and underserved communities, with an emphasis on their businesses and organizations. It's a seemingly small gesture that's historically included in the Hillsboro Police Department, but unlike many other departments, we include our first names on most of our name tags. I feel this invites community members to move away from formal titles like officer and engage in the informal and conversational use of an officer's first name. It's intended to begin a conversation on a human level and to show respect to those that we interact with. In a time when motivation is often reactionary and short-lived, Hillsboro Police Department has a history of well over 15 years in accountability. It was the first in the state of Oregon to meaningfully track the demographic characteristics of its stops. Further, it turned over its data to non-law enforcement academics such as those of Portland State University for independent analysis. Since May 25th and the death of George Floyd, the Center for Policing Equity at John Jay University School of Criminal Justice has received heavy interest for assistance from police agencies and has been often quoted as a source on police reform. CPE uses advanced analytics to diagnose disparities in policing, shed light on police behavior, and answer questions police and communities have asked for years about how to build a healthy relationship. HPD's engagement with the center began 4 years ago, well in advance of the current push. 3 years ago, CPE and the department entered into a memorandum of understanding for the purpose of analytics. HPD was the first agency in Oregon to do so and remains one of a very exclusive number to this day. The Hillsboro Police Department is designated as a Tier 1 agency in the Oregon Statistical Transparency of Policing Program, or STOP. The agency is mandated to participate by Oregon law. However, it voluntarily agreed to submit information more detailed than that required by the law as it partners with other Tier 1 agencies and the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission to greater understand the data under analysis. Our few statistical disparities in the first report are consistent with other Tier 1 agencies in general, and that is why we entered into this higher level of statistical analysis to find out what the common cause may be. The most scientifically rigorous measurements in the report show impartiality on the part of HPD. To be sure, tracking practices and habits is only half of the calculus of accountability at best. The other and more challenging half is to implement change based upon it. Conveying trustworthy motives. The department is invested in making direct connection with community members for both their enrichment and our own. It dedicates 3.5 full-time community enhancement team members and over 150 community-based volunteers of an extremely diverse background, both ethnic, culturally, racially, and language-wise, to its daily efforts. We have multiple years of participation in the Muslim Educational Trust's Building Bridges of Understanding in our community event. This is a chance to bring together law enforcement and community members to understand each other and address racial and ethnic disparities. We are also only a few weeks away from our second consecutive year of participation in the Word is Bond mentorship program in Portland. From their website, their mission is to rewrite the narrative between Black men and law enforcement through leadership development, critical dialogue, and education. Development, dialogue, and education are also at the heart of our youth services program. I'm very pleased that Detective Victor Castro has agreed to be with us tonight, and he can speak uniquely to the meaningfulness of that program. Detective Castro?
Hi, folks. Thank you for your time and for letting me share what a wonderful experience working for our youth services unit. I was in the unit for almost 13 years, and what a rewarding experience has been just working with a great, diverse group of detectives with different experiences, education, backgrounds, and just bringing a real unique, different flavor to serve our kiddos in the community. I look at my assignment in youth services as wearing many hats. I looked at it as a investigator, advocate, mentor, and role model. And that was just the best part, was really interacting with these kiddos and helping them out. Also under Chief Louie, when I first started youth services unit, he just saw the value of having us present and well, with the schools and helping our administrators and families and such. I think of like going into school and visiting, like an elementary school, and when the kiddos run up to you and they see you, and I'll get the, "Oh my goodness, who are you?" And I'll be like, "I'm your father." No, just kidding. And they'll be, "Oh, can I have some money?" So I'll tell the kiddo, "No, I'm Officer Victor." And I say, "What's your name?" And they'll say, "Hi, my name's Steve." "Well, hello, Steve. I'm Officer Victor." And Steve might say, "Well, why are you here?" "We're here to keep you safe so that you can learn and have a great time here in school." I think I could speak for my fellow youth services detectives and many of those that work in the schools, that when we refer to our students, we refer to them as our kids, our students, that they belong to us. These are our communities that we are there to help and to serve and to be available to help them with whatever we can bring. I think when it comes to safety and youth services, our presence is important. God forbid that we have that school shooting. We prepare for that. We train, we work with our administrators. We have drills, safety planning. Us as the youth services detectives, we know the realm of the school. We know the layout, the demographics, the surrounding area. God forbid, again, if something were to happen, the world would ascend upon that school to help save our kiddos, keep them safe and save lives. Patrol officers would be the same way. Get there as soon as we can to help save lives. Education, I first learned how to teach DARE. This was back in 2005. And the DARE program was the greatest way to cut my teeth into being in the classroom. And what I remember the most in DARE was being very vulnerable and just really letting go, being transparent, being real with the kids, basically stripping off your uniform. Imagine yourself being out of uniform and relating to these kiddos in a way where they can see us as helpers and that we're also teachers, and also connecting with them culturally. It's neat to see a kiddo when they'll come up and I'll start talking Spanish and, oh my God, hablas español. It's just really great to have those connections with our kids. What I loved about teaching in the schools is it gives you that face-to-face interaction. That's real when they physically see you in the classroom and engaging with them. So I used to teach DARE, which is a drug abuse resistant education, and also GREAT, which DARE we taught in 5th grade. GREAT we taught in 7th grade, which was gang resistance education training. Both lessons were life skills based, helping kids deal with peer pressure, negative impacts of some behaviors that are out there, and really promoting positivity and connections to the schools, and that they are a part of school safety. And what I loved about the way we work as school resource officers, youth services unit, we are assigned to feeder schools. So it was really neat to have them in 5th grade, have them for DARE, and then have them again in middle school, or I'd have them for GREAT, and then be with them all the way through high school. And to have that consistent, constant availability to be that go-to person for the kids, for the students. Also, the summer programs were also a great way to maintain that consistency with our students, not only through the school year, but even through summer, to let them know that we are part of the school, that we are part of the community, to help keep you engaged and be there for you. Summer camps that we've had, like the GREAT program, our current youth services detectives have awesome camps of various interests. I know Adela Rios is passionate about migrant summer school. And again, just having that face time, that personal interaction with the community, and just constant throughout the year. Working with the kids in that dynamic, I think I learned as a DARE GREAT officer is that I could stand up there and just say blah, 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 blah. The kids may not remember what I say, but I think they'll remember my interactions with them. And kids will go home and tell their parents, oh my goodness, Mom, you should meet Officer Herman Mox. He's really super cool. The kids will brag about the interactions that they have with officers, and parents will learn that, yes, we are there to help. And also, too, what I love about the schools is that the schools are a great place for parents to report things. I mean, that's the greatest place to connect to services within the community, mental health, housing, McKinney-Vento, whatever's available out there. Another one is intervention that I know that we do, and as in working in youth services, I think when students come to my attention so we do child abuse investigations, we deal with mental health, but also too, there are crimes committed on campus, such as assaults, there may be thefts, there may be something drug related, there may be social media type of harassment, if you will. I always worked, and again, I'm speaking from my experience, and I've always worked very close with the school administrators, because really the purpose is what can we do to help change this kiddo's behavior? So it may be a referral as a charge and a referral to the Washington County Juvenile Department. The Juvenile Department's goal is to change the behavior, insert services and support to change the behavior before the kiddo becomes an adult and ends up in the system. I work very closely with the Juvenile Department. I've also been able to work cases where, it could be an arrest, but sitting with the kiddo, with the student, and talking about what happened, what went wrong, and really giving them a chance to correct a wrong, to make a wrong action right. And so we talk about, what's your attendance like? What are your peers like? What's going on at home? And it's really be able to get the kiddo to share, to help them come to something and support that's going to help them get through this. And that takes a whole lot more work. It's easy to write a police report, do the referral, and be done. I liked investing my time with the kiddos to help them be successful and to help them and give them an opportunity to change a bad choice into making it a positive thing that they learn from. So I was doing restorative justice way before it became a thing. And later on, if you're interested, I'd love to share a story with you involving a kiddo from my very first DARE class. Working in the schools, also working closely with our care teams, being available to do home visits with our counselors, working with DHS. Truancy I really enjoyed because it was a great way to find out why the kiddo wasn't going to school. What are the issues? What's going on? Is it bullying? Is it maybe just not following, not being able to understand? There's always a reason why kids are going to school. So I use that as a positive tool. And for me, it was very successful when the kiddos had a really good connection with the parents to basically, so the parents wouldn't get fined, that the kiddos were willing to make the changes for the parents for them to not pay. But again, if we want the kids to change this behavior, what kind of support services can we put in place to help them be successful? Prevention is my most favorite. And I put prevention, I put advocate, mentor, role model. I love the most about being in my schools is that the kiddos would come to me for advice, for guidance, for direction. Whether it be they got in trouble for something, skipping, whatever, I always seized it as an opportunity just to sit and listen to the kiddos and find out what's going on. Teaching them to use their voice, to advocate for themselves. I learned that from Olga Acuna, where she was my vice principal at Hill High, is teaching kids encouraging them to use their voice and to speak up and to not be afraid and advocate for themselves. Some of the things that I loved doing were job shadows, getting kids who were interested in police work, getting ride-along forms, promoting our cadet program, which was a lot of fun. Also giving them kids incentives. Again, this is the way I work, giving the kiddos incentives, like at South Meadows, kiddos, when I was the SRO there, the kiddos used to earn Hawks for good behavior. And when I was there, if a student earned like 50 or 75 Hawks, I used to take them to lunch. On me, they got to pick wherever they wanted to go. China Palace buffet was like the most favorite. All you can gorge, wear stretchy pants. So we'd go there, and then I'd always I bring them to the police station and give them a tour and really give them a chance to see how the department operates and really hopefully to inspire and motivate them to step up. I tell them, I'm an old guy and I'm going to be stepping away someday. I would love for you to do what I do and do it better. That's what I love the most. The incentives to help kids change, for the incentives for good behavior. I used to buy caps and gowns for my kiddos who were checking out from high school that just why bother? It's again, working with them and implementing supports, but also having them again, using their voices. I used to buy caps and gowns. I used to buy yearbooks. I've even taken kids shopping just to keep them engaged and to feel good about themselves. If you're familiar with the Oregon Youth Challenge program in Bend, best program. It's on Bend. It's by the Oregon National Guard. It's an alternative high school. I've mentored 5 students. I'm currently mentoring one right now. I've mentored 5 students that went through the program that were successful. It's life changing. It's about really finding their purpose and learning things and pushing themselves that they never knew that they could do, and then coming back to their school environment or graduating from there or going into the military. And the mentor program is one of the best because it helps the kiddo be successful. Also in prevention, I also parent educational programs. I used to do presentations for parents in Spanish, Padres los Primeros Maestros. I should about parent accountability and their role in really utilizing services within the community. I also did one on gang awareness. I know our youth services detectives do many presentations for our parents as well regarding social media and just different topics of interest. A couple of years ago, it was really hard for me, but an opportunity came up to work in domestic violence at the Family Justice Center. And if I can share with you, the only reason why I went, I would have stayed in schools, but the only reason why I went is that traditionally, when police officers respond to domestic violence calls, they get there. Officers make the scene safe, make sure everyone is safe, separate parties, and do their investigation and, you know, gather evidence, take photo, and sometimes someone ends up going to jail. Part of the investigation, sometimes the children witness it. Sometimes the children are the callers themselves that call the police. And so officers will do the investigation, someone goes to jail. Well, imagine like the next day, the child that witnessed this violence has to go to school the next day and pretend like nothing happened. How does a child unsee what they just saw? That they saw their parent beat the other parent, and something that they're not going to get, it's going to be hard to process. So now they're in school and they have to sit there and they have to pay attention. They have to be engaged. And the teacher wonders why little Victor isn't, you know, doing his work, or what's going on with him. And so my thing was, by going to domestic violence, not only dealing with the investigations and helping our victims become survivors, my goal was to also implement services from the get-go for our kiddos. If you think of ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience, you know, the whole thing is getting these support systems in place early on so that way kids don't have hardships later on, any challenges, any bad behavior, anything that comes up. And so working domestic violence, I now, with the parent permission of the domestic violence survivor, I asked them, I say, hey, I used to be a school resource officer. Is that okay if I talk to the school counselor and maybe the principal, no details, but just say, hey, let's give little Vic some one-on-one attention. Family went through something pretty rough. Let's see about getting them some one-on-one. Let's see if we can get care teams involved to get some counseling and support services. I think that is so, so critical, because sometimes kids are forgotten. I work at the Family Justice Center, which is a one-stop shop for domestic violence in Beaverton. And it's basically have all the great services, restraining orders, domestic violence counseling. I work with my partner, Detective Pat LaMonica. We are there to meet with clients to help them get their lives back together, to recover and move forward. To this day, I still get calls from parents from my schools seeking advice. I did a summer program last year for the last couple of years with the help of some of our youth services detectives. I put on a summer camp, a week-long camp for kids that were directly involved in my domestic violence cases. The atmosphere was, I wanted the kids to feel loved, safe, and supported. Again, I'm giving you 14 years of what youth services did for me, but I can tell you my formula was basically be professional, be human, be real. And there was a couple of quotes that I had in my office at Hill High, and I love them, and I'm gonna read the quotes. One of them was Maya Angelou, which was, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. I love that. I love that saying. And I think if, yes, you know, us as police officers, you know, we step up our game and give this community the best service ever, where are we going to get these future police officers? It's by having us available, being present in the school, being those role models so they can see what we do and hopefully inspire them to be that change in the future. And also too, that, hey, when you're in trouble, when you need help, there are officers there to help you. I'm sorry, folks, I did talk a whole lot. I'm very passionate. If you're interested about that other kiddo, that story, I'd love to share that. But I think at this point, I need to hand the mic over. So thank you for your time, folks. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Victor. I hope that provided a rich understanding of what it means to be a school resource officer. We see great value in it. It's a highly sought after position in the police department, and high quality people who have to have an extraordinary level of investment in it are the ones that are ultimately selected for it. With that, I want to turn over some time to another member of the police department. This is Commander Craig Allen. He's a 25-year veteran of the police department and is in many ways the architect, historian, and deliverer of the department's use of force training, which is the crux of why we're here tonight, and its policy. He is a nationally recognized authority on the subject, and I've asked him to assist me in discussing our status in relation to 8 Can't Wait. Craig?
Chief, thank you very much. And distinguished members of the council, mayor, city manager, and all the community members there, and the staff of our city, welcome. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to spend maybe 20 minutes with you and kind of going through the principles of 8 Can't Wait and the campaign zero, et cetera. But it's a real privilege to be here tonight, and I understand deeply the tension, anger, frustration that is out there across our country regarding police use of force. It has been, I mean, I've been in law enforcement 26 years almost, 25 with Hillsboro, and it's been a deep, deep passion of mine to understand that area better, help instruct our officers and teach our officers, and help the agency along through that profound ability that we've been given and trust we've been given by the community to sometimes respond with force. But if I may, I just want to share a couple of thoughts with you. There's been, I've taught around the country on use of force, and I've testified in courts both in defense of officers and against officers in terms of their use of force. But in some of my presentations, I have a picture of the Statue of Liberty there, and I've had that for probably 20 years, and I use it as kind of a metaphor. And you look at Lady Liberty, and she has a blindfold on, and you know, that's to signify that we need to be blind, you know, to a person's race and where they've came from, you know, the power, the wealth, whether they're social, economic, disenfranchised, all those things, that we need to administer justice in a fair and equitable way. And in so many ways that applies to a police officer's use of force. But the law in itself can be so sterile. And the law in itself, even in this discussion we're having today, can be so infallible. If we look at the laws dating back to racism, the Jim Crow laws, I mean, police officers at times were clearly a part of that problem. So laws in and of themselves can be a problem, but they're cold. They're inhumane, but they are what brings our society together, and that we live under a rule of law. But what struck me so profoundly is last week I was watching the funeral of George Floyd, and I was listening to his brother, Philonise Floyd, speak, and I watched him speak at that funeral, and just his courage, his sincerity, his deep pain, and at times his humor and lightheartedness, and his desire to change was so impressive. And then the following day, he stood up there, or he sat up there at the House of Representatives and spoke to Congress about those same struggles. And if you look at Philonise Floyd, what he embodies is that humanistic approach that the law sometimes doesn't have. And bear with me, I'm going to get this back to use of force in just a second, but the goal we should have when we look at an officer's use of force is we're granted authority under law, we're given that trust by the community we serve, we've took a solemn oath to uphold that, citizens' rights, etc. But in there needs to be woven throughout that a humanistic view, a desire to serve people, no matter where they're at in their life. And a lot of times with police officers, we encounter these folks when they're at their most vulnerable, when they're the most downtrodden. And we're asked to kind of intercede in this time and at times respond if need be, if necessary, with reasonable force. But we need to have that element of humanity. And I just think that with the Philonise Floyd, some of his discussions and how he spoke to that so caringly and with conviction, I think is the exact correct metaphor of law interceding, crossing with humanity. So I just wanted to put that out there. I was trying to script that, but I thought, you know what? I've just been ruminating on that and thinking about that, so I wanted to share that. 25 years, like I said, I've been at it. Use of force clearly is my passion. I've been so tremendously impressed with the women and men of our police department. And I just think it's important to note that you know, time and time again, I've been just so impressed with their dignity, their compassion, their discernment in using force from time to time, their unbelievable courage in other times. And I'm just proud to serve alongside those folks and to be a part of that. So I think it's important in this the national narrative is right. It's correct. We need to have some reforms out there. But as I get into the 8 can't wait, I think it's also important. We are such a very diverse nation. We're such a, and likewise, police departments are very diverse. And, we can talk about policy and we can talk about training, and those are all important. But at the core of that is the message from the top, right? It starts with Chief Coleman down through Deputy Chief Mike Leader, that we have to have a core conviction of humanity in our police officers, what they stand for, how they interact with society. And that's going to go far beyond what might be written down in a policy. But policy is very important. So I'm going to go through these 8 tenets of the Campaign Zero's 8 Can't Wait. And at the end of that, I'm going to yield back to Chief Coleman, and I think we'll open up for some questions there. I'm not sure of the exact protocol, but I appreciate you letting me get through the 8 tenets, and then I'd be happy to take any questions on that. So let me, if somebody there can put up a slide, please, of the 8 Can't Wait tenets. Okay, it's right there on my screen. So let's start at the top. Ban chokeholds and strangleholds. Well, let me just pause there for a second. When we talk about policy and use of force, it's important to remember one thing, that in order for an officer's use of force to be deemed reasonable or justified, it needs to comport with 3 things. 1, federal law and state law. That has to comport with those, what the law tells us we can do and in what confines. It has to comport with agency policy. What does policy say we can and cannot do, and it has to comport with training. So if any one of those pillars fall down, we're going to have problems there looking at an officer's force. So we need to work within those 3 main pillars. And so I say that because as we go through these 8 tenets, I'm going to kind of jump back and forth a little bit between policy, a little bit about federal law, a little bit about state law, and a little bit about training. So it's going to be kind of woven through there. Just as a quick use of force law 101, when we talk about that interaction, when a police officer uses force, it's by the very definition an infringement upon a person's 4th Amendment interest to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, seizures being the element that use of force deals with. And so it's the burden is on the police officer to explain their actions, and those actions need to comport with the objectable reasonable standards, which we'll talk about here in just a second. We'll also talk about Oregon use of force law, and it's a little different than the 4th Amendment. That Oregon law has a necessity component in it, as opposed to the federal laws, which is based on a 4th Amendment objective reasonableness standard. Oregon's law is a necessity-based standard. So when we get down to one of these tenets where it deals with alternatives, I'll talk a little bit about state law and the necessity to use force, etc. So there's just a quick kind of a snapshot of federal law and state law pertaining to use of force. All right, let's get into it. Ban chokeholds and strangleholds under 8 Can't Wait. Couldn't agree more. I've in my entire time at Hillsboro Police, we've never taught that. We've never even applied that. We've never done it. But it's not expressly prohibited in policy, probably because we've never done it. So I would agree, we probably do need to make a note in there to look at that, to exclude that. I would only put a caveat there that is within most forces, it would be prohibited unless deadly force is justified. But again, we don't do it. We've never used it. A lot of this, I don't think any law enforcement uses strangleholds. Usually that's called a lateral vascular neck restraint. But again, we don't do those. So we would be in compliance with or along the same lines as that one tenet. Required de-escalation. I can't agree with that more, and I am so proud. Our police department's been the champion in that area, and it really started back with, and again, I just want to put a footnote. I'm not trying to be up here, be a big apologist for Hillsboro Police, but some of these, it's important to just give the full context. De-escalation, it started back with Chief Ron Louis, geez, back in probably, 2002, that all of our officers needed to have mediation training. That went into advanced mediation training. That's 40 hours per block, so 80 hours total. When Chief Dabrowski came here about 6 years ago, he introduced a big push, and I think Chief Coleman had spoke to this, about getting our officers crisis intervention training certified. And we undertook a 3-year project, getting all of our staff through there. I think we have about 82% certified, and a component, a large component of crisis intervention training deals with de-escalation. We have de-escalation in our policy. It is, officers do need to consider that if time and circumstances permit. It's vitally important that we slow the tempo of the incident. It's vitally important that we stabilize the scene, bring in resources, because that sets the stage for us to start to build rapport with the person. And through that process, we can get into gaining influence and persuasion, and those are all great steps where we don't have to resort to use force. So de-escalation is a really key component. I'm glad that 8 Can't Wait put it in there because it's critical. So we would be right in line with that. Require warnings before shooting. And the one thing I would encourage you also to do is Campaign Zero does have a very well put together website, a lot of resources on there, and they have a model policy that they would recommend, and I have it pulled up in front of me here, and because I kind of wanted to read that model policy and see how that corresponds with some of these tenets, and I wanted to look at the require a warning before shooting. And we do that. That's one of our requirements. That has been a part of Hillsboro Police's training and application since I've been here. That emanates from a 1985 case, Tennessee versus Gardner, and it was further talked about in Graham versus Connor in 1989. But I want to just touch on real quickly the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, right? So in the United States, we have 13 different circuits, and the Ninth Circuit is the largest. And I mention that because, like I talked about, a police officer's use of force is most normally scrutinized under the Fourth Amendment. And there's a lot of case law out there that gives officers guidance on what is appropriate and inappropriate or reasonable and unreasonable necessary force. And the Ninth Circuit is unique in terms of its warnings and the requirements they place on law enforcement officers. And I could just give you a few cases. If you feel like scribbling them down, you could go research them, and I think it makes for some good reading. But in the Ninth Circuit, we have one right out of our own county, Glenn versus Washington County, came out in 2014, that deals specifically with warnings and why warnings are important, and allowing people to comply to those warnings if they can. Another case which speaks squarely on the point is Brooks versus Seattle. I don't remember that. I think that came out in 2012. But it was where an officer had tasered a person. It was a black woman for a minor violation. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found initially that force was unreasonable. But what they said about warnings was that when a warning's given and force is applied, you need to allow a reasonable time for the person to comply to what warning you're given or what force you're doing. So we're also governed under that. Diora v. Rutherford is another case that deals with not giving cryptic warnings. Officers need to give clear, specific guidance what it is their intent is. And I could just go down a whole list. But the Ninth Circuit has been very clear on warnings and that law enforcement needs to give those. And they put in an if feasible. And I just want to point out, in the tenets of 8 Can't Wait, it says, require warnings before shootings. But it is important just to point out that sometimes you might not be able to get a warning in there. That's why they have the if feasible. And if you look at the 8 can't wait model policy, it also says that same language, that officers shall give a warning before shooting if feasible. So we are 100% in line with that one. That's important. And I guess the reason why I'm talking a lot about the circuit courts and the Ninth Circuit Court is the next tenet we're going to come to. We're going to talk about alternatives here, but the majority of our guidance in law enforcement in terms of use of force comes from the appellate rulings and sometimes from the Supreme Court, but predominantly we rely upon case law within the circuit to give us guidance on what is reasonable and unreasonable force. So the Ninth Circuit is, there's a lot of case law out there. All right, require all alternatives be exhausted before shooting. Again, we would be in compliance with this if you look at the broader language in the model policy from Campaign Zero and you look within our policy 300. And let me just add, our policy currently is under revision. It'll probably be out in about the next month. We're going to a slightly more, I think in some ways it's just more an elaborate policy on use of force. I'll talk about that here a little bit later, but under our current policy, we don't specifically say alternatives must be exhausted. We do say other options should be explored, and I agree that's a little vague. So we are in the process of changing that. In fact, in our new policy, since I was in part one of the drafters of it, I believe it says, and this is off the top of my head, but it says, officers shall, if time and circumstances permit, consider other alternatives, or I'm sorry, lesser alternatives to effect capture. And that language, by the way, comes right out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. They are a unique circuit in one sense, that they're the only circuit in America that requires for federal law that officers consider lesser alternatives. And that's unique, and that's in our policy, and that's been a part of our training for well over a decade. So we're just getting our policy up to date with our training, but considering lesser alternatives is certainly important. That's something that we're going to do. I'm trying to just look here real quick on, well, in the when it says require all alternatives be exhausted before shooting, and I went to, because when I first read that, I thought, well, that could be a little challenging because, you know, there's always, you know, take any force situation, even quote the best force situation, it would seem like you could find, you know, other alternatives. And so I was a little bit, you know, curious about that. But they describe it in the model policy, which I think is just right on the money. And it says there, it says, departments shall use only physical force or deadly physical force when no other viable options are available and when all non-physical options are exhausted. And then it says below that, the minimum degree of force is the lowest level of force within a range of objectively reasonable force that is necessary to effect arrest. So and in my reading of that, it says, yes, you need to use the minimal amount of force. And it needs, but it still gives the allowance for, you know, it doesn't have to be the bare bones minimum. And that would be the one that I would think we might probably have the most discussion over. Federal law currently doesn't require that police use the absolute minimum use of force. It just needs to be within that realm of objectively reasonable force. And maybe that's a good time to talk about that. So, because one of these tenets is continuums, but this is a good segue to that. Graham versus Connor, 1989 case. It's kind of the seminal case out there from the U.S. Supreme Court that gives guidance to police officers in 4 primary categories. And it says, in order for your force to be reasonable, we or the agency will look at the imminency of threat the person poses to the officer or others. We're going to look at the severity of crime, what's being committed, what is our interest, the governmental interest to take that person into custody. We're going to look at the degree of resistance the person poses and whether or not the person is escaping or are they trying to flee from arrest. There's a couple of underlying tenets. One, you cannot assume the negative. You need to be able to articulate reasonable perceptions, etc. But those are kind of the four main tenets of Graham. And rightfully so, there's been a lot of commentary nationwide that Graham versus Connor is cast at too broad of a case. It doesn't give adequate guidance to police officers just by those four tenets. And even a lot of federal case law says that we need to get more specific. We need to get more guidance to officers. And I would agree. I mean, I love the Graham tenets. I think they give good guidance. But let me point out one thing. This goes back to our Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. We're all so unique, being Oregon in that circuit, that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in a 2002 decision, Chu versus Gates, that was in Darrell Gates of Los Angeles, they said, we're going to take the Graham factors and we're going to prioritize one of them and put more weight on that one. And that would be the imminency of threat to the officer. What's the degree of that? And so we're unique that way. We're the only circuit that prioritizes the Graham factors. So when an officer responds with force, even in my position now, well, my former position as the training lieutenant, I would review officers' use of force. So the first thing we go to is you look at the tally of circumstances, and we have to ask ourselves, what is the degree of threat the person's posing? And that gets more weight than the other ones. But let me just go back, because I may have skipped over it. So I do agree with the commentary that just those 4 Graham principles can be too vague. And so policies have evolved to put more and more tenets in there that we want officers to pay attention to in the force transaction. Our current policy has 10 tenets. So instead of just Graham's 4, we've expanded that to 10. The model policy from Campaign Zero has 12. Our policy that's coming out again here in about a month has 16 tenets. And one of those is lesser alternatives to force, warnings, etc. So I really believe it's a very comprehensive policy. It has prohibitions about shooting against moving vehicles, unless there's extreme extenuating circumstances. But I think it gives really good guidance for officers how we need to respond judiciously and prudently within that realm of use of force. But let me just continue here. Thank you for allowing me to kind of go on that little tangent with alternatives, because I think that's an area we need to explore more. But duty to intervene, I'm just going to own it. I apologize. Our old policy, I drafted most of it, and I just flat forgot to put it in there. You're going to say, aha, wait a minute, Craig, what are you doing on that? But duty to intervene, I have embedded in more PowerPoints that I've given back to the year 2000. So duty to intervene is in our use of force pamphlets. It's in numerous PowerPoint presentations. It has been a part of our training regime for decades. But it is not currently in our policy. Our new policy coming out has a section just specifically devoted to the duty to intervene, that if police officers are in a situation where they observe what they believe to be excessive force, they're required to intervene in that. And even federal law backs that up. There's federal case law speaking to an officer can be held liable if they do not intervene in a situation like that. So I agree that needs to be there. We need to be the safeguards of that. That's just very, very important. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. It's not our current use of force policy. I think it's policy 305, discharge of firearms with no human injury. It does prohibit, and it expressly says all Hillsboro police officers are prohibited from shooting motor vehicles. Does give a little out clause, except in extreme extenuating circumstances. So I would agree, and I think the impetus behind that is, you don't want law enforcement officers creating their own exigency or stepping in front of cars and saying, okay, well, I stepped in front of the car to get them to stop, and now they surge at me, well, then now I respond with deadly force. So you're almost creating the circumstance to respond with deadly force. So, or reaching inside the vehicles. Portland had a case like that not too long ago. So we've been, again, that's a part of our training curriculum well over 2 decades, that, do not put yourself in a position where you create your own urgency to respond with force specifically to vehicles. Don't reach into vehicles. Don't try to turn ignitions off. Because if the car drives away, we're going to say, well, I felt in imminent jeopardy, the car's going to run over me. So that's important. So our current policy, just to be succinct, does prohibit it. It does give a caveat that we could do it in extreme and extenuating circumstances. We've done it one time at Hillsboro, I can say, where we did shoot at a vehicle that was involved in a fairly significant domestic disturbance, and after a very short couple block pursuit with the vehicle, it was I forget, it was a big jacked up Dodge truck, and it had pulled into a cul-de-sac with a couple of our officers, and the officers had they had stopped right, not in the round part of the cul-de-sac. The truck was in the round part of the cul-de-sac, but the officers were out there, just as you kind of enter the cul-de-sac area, and they were giving warnings and commands to the driver of the truck, and he had put it in reverse and floored it and peeled out, I guess for lack of better words, and jumped up onto the curb and came within just inches of the officer who was pinned next to his driver's door. And so he had no means to escape or to flee, and he had fired into the vehicle as it was driving directly at him. That was the only case I can think of in Hillsboro where we've shot at a vehicle. But I agree with that, and our new policy will also have that same language, that you're prohibited from shooting at moving vehicles except in extreme and extenuating circumstances. So that's that. Require the use of force continuum. This is interesting. I gave this one a lot of thought, and I'll just try to boil it down this way. The use of force continuum essentially has evaporated from law enforcement probably a decade ago. Oregon quit using it in 2012 per DPST. I know Hillsboro, we quit using it in, probably 2007 when I was a training sergeant. We got rid of it. And you're going to ask why? Well, why not? Why not use a continuum? And first of all, the continuums, they came out in about the 1970s. And the continuum, and maybe you're asking, well, what is a continuum? Basically, it's it's a piece of paper. Sometimes it's a wheel, but it's a piece of paper. And on the left side of the piece of paper, you have behaviors of the suspect, or I shouldn't say behaviors, they're actual actions that the suspect or the person might take. And on the right side of the paper, it's like levels of force. And so it's in Oregon's, it was a 6-layer or 6-level continuum, one being that when an officer shows up on scene, that's like the lowest level of force. And then you move up to directed holds and guidance, where you can, touch and move and control people. Then it gets into kind of this middle area, which is whether the person's passive resistive or actively resisting. And then if they were doing that behavior, you could respond with intermediate levels of force, which include tasers and takedowns and hair takedowns and all this stuff. And I just remember thinking back, and I said, well, how terribly confusing, because there's no way possible you could put down every dynamic that an officer may confront behavior-wise and encapsulate that in an 8.5, 11 piece of paper. And so I said, the other thing is, why in the world are we discounting volumes and volumes of case law and not abiding by what the courts want us to do, how they expect us to work within law in using force and responding with force? And so I think we were one of the first agencies in Oregon to move away from the continuum, and that has really caught on nationwide. And so I was a little bit perplexed when I saw 8 Can't Wait throwing that in here. And so, again, I went to their model policy, and I think I know why, and I'm in somewhat agreement with it, but not in the context of the continuum. So if you scroll down, and you can access this on their website, but when they talk about continuums, what they're talking about is factors to consider. They talk about levels of force, and but it says this under intermediate force, and intermediate's like a taser, just generally speaking, or like oleoresin capstun or capstun. It says and this is the definition of intermediate force. It says this level of force poses a foreseeable risk of significant injury or harm, but it's unlikely to cause death. Intermediate force will only be authorized when officers are confronted with an active or assaultive aggression and the intermediate threat to the safety of officers or others. Certain force options, such as OC spray, impact projectiles, and baton strikes are intermediate force, which are likely to cause significant injury. So I would just proffer this, that shooting a 40 millimeter beanbag round at somebody is definitely a higher level or quantum of force than being hit with a taser. So when you do continuums, you tend to lump all these under the category of active resistance, and that can give a real misnomer for police officers when they're responding with force. I got to be kind of careful here in this next story. I don't want to, let me see, how do I approach this? Well, all officers use tasers across the US for the most part. There's a lot of them out there. When that product first came in to our field in about 2002, it was widely taught that we could use tasers for non-compliance, and that was vendor-driven, not law-driven. And so you had officers using a lot of tasers for non-compliance, and non-compliance is not active resistance. And lo and behold, we had a whole slew of case law come in there. The chief one, Bryan versus McPherson, Ninth Circuit, 2012, which says the taser is an intermediate force option requiring a strong governmental interest. My point is this: when you look at the continuum and you're equating a taser with active resistance, you can confuse officers. I would propose, let's just give them the law, give them the tenets in law. Let's expand on that through agency prerogatives to be more conservative in force, and let's reinforce that through training. Let me give you one last example. All of us have seen the protests in Portland. And one of those scenes, right, is that fence around the Justice Center, right? And they have the lights down there and the protesters are there. Well, let me work with you on a hypothetical, if you wouldn't mind. So you're the police officer, and I want you to approach this under the view of a continuum, okay? And so the continuum, Oregon's continuum says, and so does the model policy in Campaign Zero says, if it's active resistance, then you can respond with an intermediate force level, which would be like a taser. So let's play this out. You're down there at those protests, you're the police officer, and you see a person up there at the fence. And by the way, that the Portland Police Bureau has said, do not try to climb the fence, don't cut holes in the fence, don't tear down the fence. If you do, we may arrest you. But you notice a person's up there, they're jerking on the fence hard, and you notice that they pull out kind of like a wire clipper and they start clipping the fence. And so you go up there and you say, hello, I can't have you doing that. That's prohibited. I need you to stop doing that. And you reach out and you touch them. You just touch their wrist. Maybe you put your left hand on their back, and you're just trying to get them, like, let's not keep cutting through that fence. And they brush you away. In fact, they take their right arm, if you're standing on their right, and they hit you in the chest, whack in the chest, get away from me. And you step back and you move back in and you touch them, you reach them, you say, you can't do that, you're resisting arrest, and they jerk away from you. They pull away from you hard, and it pulls you into them, and they keep jerking with you. Well, I would ask, by definition, is that active resistance? Yes. But what if I tell you the person doing that is a 79-year-old lady? Well, that would not be reasonable force under any court, let alone any policy. that would not comport with the tenets in Graham. It wouldn't comport with the tenets across the Ninth Circuit. It wouldn't be in line with our policies or training. So again, I think so we do not have the continuum in our policy. I do not foresee that coming back. I think that will only cause confusion. And it will cause confusion in two ways. It can confuse the officers where we respond with force, and correspondingly that can cause additional undue harm to persons. So it's meant as a training aid. That was the whole reason the continuum was to show a brand new police officer, who's trying to get their head around all this use of force stuff, that here's a graphic depiction of what use of force looks like. But it was never meant to be codified in policy and made this omnipresent document. So fortunately or unfortunately, the continuum, so our agency doesn't have it in our policy. I'm not sure I don't know of any agencies that do. I know one of the research projects that was behind Campaign Zero was, they looked at, it was a bunch. I think it was 45, 50 agencies across the U.S. It was a comparative study, and those agencies that had more restrictive policies, the correlation was there was lesser uses of force. And I guess I don't know if a lot of those policies had continuums in it, but that's pretty dated. All right, so let me move on. Let me finish up with this last one here. Require comprehensive reporting. This is a big one. This is where we need to be the safeguards, the gate guards, how we look at our use of force and analyze it. So our current policy is not very robust in that. Oh, I apologize. No, I take that back. We have a whole separate policy. Pardon me, folks. I was going back to our first policy. I've been through 4 policy revisions. Our first policy, 15 years ago, was really void on the subject. And our particular oversight, just being very transparent, was nothing more than signatures on this use of force data checklist, and it really had no oversight. And we had moved away from that and went to a robust after action review where the sergeants are required to write extensively about and analyze the sergeant's use of force or force response. That's given to the lieutenant, and the lieutenant needs to write extensively about that. It goes up to the commander, up to the chief. It's a robust system. And we adopted policy 302 about 2 years ago that speaks at length about our requirements to document and to review an officer's use of force. We also brought on some software, some tracking software that we put all this data in there, the type of force, the amount of force, all the demographics of the person, us. And so we can go back and look at if there's any trends that we need to pay attention to, if there's any early warning signs that pop up in terms of an officer's force response, et cetera. So from a managerial side, I think we're doing pretty good there. Excuse me. From an organizational oversight perspective, I think we are doing quite well there. There's always room for improvement. I don't doubt that at all. In some ways, I think we're fortunate. I know Portland's went through a lot of this with and I know they've negotiated their consent decree down, but I think they have like 3 different boards and committees, and there's a lot of bureaucracy there. But at the end of the day, oversight is critical. And when we look at an officer's use of force, can I just end with this, please? Just give me, if you would indulge me with just 2 minutes and I'll be done. Even when we look at policy and use of force and training, it's important we have a discussion kind of on a trainer's or an agency's perspective on use of force. And I'm using the terms conservative and liberal, not in a political sense, but in terms of just being more judicious or lenient on use of force. So we have long held at Hillsboro. In fact, you're hearing a lot of narrative out there, disbanding qualified immunity. And I'm not, for those of you that aren't aware what qualified immunity is, it's a particular part of the law that gives allowances for officers if their force isn't overly unreasonable, or it wouldn't be clear to a reasonable officer that was unreasonable. But there's a movement underway to get rid of qualified immunity. And when we talk about the agency's view of use of force, I've said this for 20 years, all of our trainers preach it. We have a strong belief here in Hillsboro that we want to be conservative on our applications of force, because this might be some of the rhetoric here. Well, it's good to push the gray areas. Let's get into that and kind of see how far we can take it. And I'm just using that generally. But when it comes to use of force, we want to be very judicious with that, very conservative with that. We do not want to be pushing that envelope of qualified immunity, pushing the envelope of what the law allows to. That's not good for the overall law enforcement community. And it's certainly not good for the agency, and it's certainly not good for the persons who we come in contact with. So I wrap that under the comprehensive reporting elements, because when you review use of force, you're going to look at that, from your own personal lens of what is reasonable or necessary. And so I think it's important to have a conservative view on that. One last point, if I could please. There's a lot of discussion about, well, we want to have just necessary force, not reasonable force. And maybe I already touched on this. They're not necessarily one and the same. I'm not going to get too deep on this subject, but necessary force is embodied in Oregon law. And if you look at Oregon's use of force statutory law, it says here in 161.235, this is the statute that allows police officers to respond with force. And it says, a police officer is justified in using physical force upon another person only when and to the extent the police officer reasonably believes it's necessary. So necessary is captured right there. It's a little bit more of a restrictive standard. Under deadly force, which is more along the lines of what 8 Can't Wait looks at, so 161.239 deadly force, it says a police officer may respond with deadly force. I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but it says regardless of the particular offense, the use of deadly force is necessary to defend the peace officer or other person from the threat and imminent use of deadly physical force. Under the type of circumstances existing at the time and place, the use of such force is necessary. So we already embody that standard in Oregon. So we are in line with that thought process that force needs to be necessary. So it's necessary in Oregon. It's objectively reasonable at the federal level. And that's that. So I'm concluded with that. I appreciate you just indulging me as I talk through this. I welcome any questions you may have when we're done, and I will yield back to Chief Coleman.
I have, hi, it's Olivia Alcare, and I have,
Councilor Alfieri, can we wait until the entire, presentation is done?
I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you, because
Sorry.
Commander Allen and Detective Castro will both be available, as will Chief Coleman, for our Q&A time.
Yeah, and thank you. You have been extremely gracious in allowing us to talk about the police department and the things we thought were relevant tonight to the discussion. And I am wrapping up with just a few thoughts at the end here, but I hope we have portrayed the seriousness with which we have not just visited this subject tonight, but the history of the police department. All that being said, we realize that this is a moment in time where we need to be open to input and acknowledge that a lot of these approaches to these subjects have been of our own volition, and they need to have a wider contribution from people that live in our community and even have been subject to our application of it. We appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation tonight and to do it in our corner of America. There have been several tragedies since the murder of George Floyd, some of them enormous and some of them on a smaller scale, as in the Hillsboro Police Department. There's a looming tragedy that hangs in the balance, that of the undoing of years of even decades of work to build relationships of trust. There have certainly been steps forward and the occasional steps backward. Detective Castro shared his story with you. He's an exceptional law enforcement professional. His attitude is not the exception at HPD. On behalf of the men and women who take on so many roles, I ask you not to discard their work, but to use it to start from somewhere other than zero. 183 department members engender thousands of years of public service in Hillsboro. Hard to get your head around, it's true. They've been in the arena. They're not deaf to the cries of frustration. They are just waiting for the opportunity to prove they make Hillsboro better. We recognize racism remains in our society throughout the United States. We're striving to understand that Black community members and other communities of color have additional dimensions to their everyday existence, a dimension enhanced by experience, and one where the sight of a police car causes anxiety, where suspicion accompanies everyday tasks such as shopping, and so many other injustices that come in a myriad of forms. We share the historical and ongoing efforts of this police department only to set the stage for hopeful progress. We may make mistakes, experience setbacks, and we are committed to the accountability that must accompany those. Now is your police department. It's our time to listen. Thank you so much for listening to us tonight. We seek to understand better those we serve. We pledge to bring public safety to Hillsboro in the way the public wants it delivered, an engaged and committed organization that reflects the ideals of those it seeks to serve. Thank you, and we are ready for your questions.
Very good. Thank you, Chief. I'll go ahead and start with Councilor Alcair, and thank you for waiting. Thank you to Commander Allen and Detective Castro, and to you, Chief, for your presentation. And we look forward to the Q&A section right now. So, Councilor Alcair.
Thank you. And I appreciate the presentations tonight. And Jim, you and I have had a chance to have, I think, really good conversations about what kinds of things need to change. But I just want to make a comment, then I have a question for Victor, actually. So my comment is this: the whole reason why we're here is what's happening nationally. And there are things that are connected to racism that are driving all of these things that are impacting people and the demands to want to have change. In talking about the intent of the system and what what you put forth, I know of at least 2 cases where a second report had to be done when something violent has happened to a citizen, where they had video and it wasn't believed. And so we can talk about the system and what you have working, but I want to try to understand those cops who go into those situations. And I have met some cops who have, it's complex, right? But in these 2 cases that I have had, why didn't they look at the evidence? Why didn't they talk, why didn't they believe the person who was offended or hurt? Why did it take me as a city councilor to step in and ask some questions when things would happen? So I just want to make that comment, and other people will have more questions. Victor, you talked about the resource officers and the role that they play in helping students, and you have discussed a lot of things that are really important. But we heard at the protests, and I don't think any kid would have taken their time from a Friday night or a Friday afternoon to go do something else and have fun and be at home because of quarantine, but they came there to the Civic Center to describe what kind of racist actions and epithets that they face in the school system. Now, the city can't do anything about the school system, but I'm asking you, Victor, what are you hearing when kids talk about the racism that they experience, the names that they get called? Do they feel comfortable even discussing that or bringing that up? And those kids, I consider them the citizens that I serve as a city councilor. They may be in school from 9 to 3, but after that, they're with us and they're our citizens and need to be They need to be safe 24/7. They need to be safe, including in school. So thank you.
I appreciate that question, and I love it because as I said earlier, that the way we look at our students, we look at them not as these students, but our students, our kids. When I've had kids come to me that have talked about these things, and some where I would hear it a lot was like the teachers are just ignoring me. They aren't giving me the attention, or I feel like they don't care. And when I was a school resource officer, it was really at the height of immigration and the climate, and it was really, really difficult. And so when kids would come to me, hey, if there was something that was anything remotely like a crime or intimidation, of course, with school administrators, we would insert ourselves to help fix this problem. My thing with the kids was always, and I always call all my students, mijo, mija, my son, my daughter, mijo, you have to be able to use your voice. If something is going on, say something, call that person out, and don't be afraid to ask for help. If you just sit back and let it go, it's not going to go away. It's not going to disappear. I've experienced, as a Latino kid, I've experienced some real ugly. And so I can identify with these kids, and it hurts. And so all I could do as an SRO as a school resource officer, detective, is to listen. That's, as I mentioned earlier, that our jobs is to be mentors, role models, and advocates. That's the whole, and that's what I loved about the assignment, is that I can be your cheerleader. I will be there 100% for you. Do your part. If you're not doing well in class, well, what is it that you're doing? Go to class every day, turn in your assignments. Don't be afraid to raise your hand and ask for help. But if anyone is making you feel uncomfortable, less than, that's not okay. That's not okay. You have to speak up. And if you feel that you're not getting the help, then let's go to the next step. But my thing was to really support the kiddos and to help them get there to a place where they feel that they are treated with dignity and respect. And I take that very personally, again, having been there. So that's very important to me, and operating and working with our kiddos. And also, if I can mention, when we're off duty, the kids still contact me. It's not like we go home and we just like take care of business. The kids, they become part of our lives. And even some of the check-ins, and even to this day, I still have students who are now adults reach out to me. I've even had, and I forgot to mention that working domestic violence, sadly, I've already had about 5 cases of former students who are now adults and victims of domestic violence. A couple of them have reached out personally to me to report because the same thing, they felt like if I talk to another officer, they're not gonna get it. And or Officer Victor, I can't relate to them. They don't get us. They don't get up. Then let's go through this and let's talk about it. But I think it's for all of us. We have to step up our game, and to be there, to be available, and most importantly, to listen.
I agree. But I also want to say that a child or an adult with inside a system is powerless and may not always have you or Adela around to be able to manage a situation like that. It happens.
It does.
And adults do it. So it's unfair to expect a kid to put the onus on the kid to be the person who's been offended and to also be the reporter. And so I just want to say that. And I think, Jim, this goes for adults too. If they don't trust, they're not going to speak up. And we want them to speak up because we want them to be safe. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that.
We agree.
I have some questions as well.
Council, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Chief Coleman, Detective Castro, and Commander Allen, thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it. I do have a bunch of questions, to be frank. First, I would really like, I appreciated the background that Commander Allen provided, but I would just really like to know, first on training, what is trained and what actually happens in some cases and in some organizations is different. When I was in the military, the manual said one thing, but what we were trained was different. And I'd like to know, first, do our policies are they reflected in training? And I would just a brief, whoever wants to answer, I don't need a whole long thing. Go ahead.
I will, I'll just start because
Okay.
Commander Allen has been there training our folks for many, many years. He's about to assume command of our patrol division. which is not unthoughtfully gone through, as the marriage between what's happening on in the patrol unit, the folks that have the most contact with the community, and what we've trained. He can certainly dive in more specifically, but one thing that I think is not typical of all agencies, I can't tell you what the percentages is or not, but our supervisors that are out there in the field and do the quality control, do the entries, do the analysis, they're required to go to the training. They're required to know what the plan is. They're required to know what our plans are, even in the most extreme circumstances, such as mass casualty circumstances. So that's one example, Counselor, of you are right. You have to marry the policy and, more importantly, the intent of the policy with the practice.
Yes. Great.
Thank you very much. I would say yes. I firmly believe our policies are captured in training. I would take it one step further that we know from a human performance standpoint that policies are very cerebral, very prefrontal cortex related. We put a lot of stuff in here. But where the breakdown happens is when officers are put in situations where other parts of our brain take over, the amygdala, hippocampus. It relies there on memories and systems that have been put in place. And so we're very big on scenario-based training. And we just went into an 8-hour verbal and technical de-escalation. Well, it was part lecture, 3 hours lecture, 4.5 hours in the field, where we talk about the tenets of de-escalation, and then we go out and through, fake scenarios, we get appropriate arousal so that we can seat some of those memories in the officer's brain, hopefully that they can rely upon that in the future. So that's just one example where our policy says this, we firmly believe that, and our training represents that. Because you're right, just put a bunch of words down. If you don't go out there and do it, that's a gong in the wind.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you is that your training matches your policy.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Again, yes or no question to be super clear. Do you train chokeholds and strangleholds?
No.
Is it in your policy to use them?
No.
Thank you. Do you train de-escalation?
Yes.
Is it in your policy to de-escalate?
Yes.
Thank you. Do you require warnings before shooting?
Yes.
Do you train that?
Yes.
And it's in your policy?
Yes.
Thank you. Do you train a duty to intervene?
Yes.
Is it in your policy?
Not currently. It will be in the new one.
And when will that be?
Probably 1 month out.
Thank you. Do you train not to shoot at moving vehicles? You gave the scenario, but do you train not to do that?
No. We
Okay.
have not. We've not trained that.
Okay. And so I also remember you said it would be in your policy.
It will be in our new policy. It's in our current policy.
It's in your current policy. Okay.
Yes, it'll be in the new one.
Okay. And then will it eventually be trained?
Well, I'd love to do it. I have to kind of think about how to do that.
Okay.
Because you're trying to train.
Again, because it's in your policy, but to train not to do that. Okay.
I'm totally open to it. Totally open to it. I'll give that some definite consideration.
Okay. And I'm going to skip over the use of force continuum. I thought it was very interesting when you talked about how it was a practice and how it's not a practice. But I would love to, you don't have to answer this now, but I think it would be important to look at this, the use of force continuum, to understand the intent, which I believe you understand, and figure out a way to train that. So if we don't necessarily use the continuum, what else are we using, and is it comparable?
Counselor, I'm sorry, just quickly,
Yep.
on the duty to intervene,
Yes.
that will be specifically noted in our policy. However, I think it's implied through our canon of ethics as well. So that's one thing to note.
Thank you. And then not the last question, but the last area was requiring comprehensive reporting. Commander Allen, you said, I think we're doing pretty good here. And I want to reference Counselor Allcare's question. I have also been on the receiving end, not in Hillsboro, of not so great reporting. And I don't want to hear we're doing pretty good here.
Correct.
I think this is something that it needs to be in our policy and it needs to be trained. I understand that reporting is not the most favorite part of an officer's job. But I think it is critical to accurately portray what happened. And I think part of this has to do with how officers interact with the community. And it sounds like you were just doing training on that, on how to interact and how to talk with the public in a positive and supportive way when appropriate. So I would ask that you not do pretty good here. I would ask that you improve there, which you've already said that you want to do that.
I agree.
Okay, thank you. The other thing, and I'm going to kind of switch gears here a little bit, is that there's a flip side to all of this, right? Is that what's happening in the world, as Councillor Allcare referenced, is bringing this to light. It's evident by the work that you're doing that this is not a reactionary thing that you're doing. For example, working with the Center for Policing Equity. You've been working with them for 4 years, and that's great. And I encourage you to continue to do that. I want to flip it here and understand what is the protocol regarding officers in an officer-involved shooting. And before you answer that, this is why I ask. I think in some cases it can be very clear that an officer was in the wrong. I think in some cases it cannot be clear. And an officer, just as anybody else, should have the opportunity to say what happened before they are relieved of duty. And so I was wondering, what is the protocol for an officer in an officer-involved shooting, so all parties get to explain what happened?
Yeah, thank you, Counselor. Obviously, these are usually very complex situations.
Yes, yeah.
There's everything doesn't hit stop the moment shots are fired and the ultimate results transpire. But speaking in the most general terms, of course, they're all dealt with slightly differently depending on the circumstances. There's immediate detachment of command personnel, that there's a locking down of evidence, even a capturing of evidence, and that includes securing the tools that the officers have, not just the officer that's involved, but the officers. It may be certainly the weapon of the officer involved, but it also may be other weapons under some circumstances to make sure that there weren't other undetected rounds fired. It's certainly taking possession of the contents of body-worn cameras. It's doing our level best to collect depictions, including audio, but certainly visual, whether pictures or moving pictures of, lately there's the phenomena of Ring doorbells. And in a recent officer-involved shooting, some of our information came from that. The officer is escorted by a member of the police department, but they are also afforded a representative from their police association. We then activate a county-wide major crimes team response. That's under the direction of the district attorney's office. And there's usually a prosecuting district attorney that's assigned on call for that unit. We take caution to, whenever possible, sometimes there's limitations on personnel, but to recuse the agency that's involved from that call out of those personnel. They do the investigation, which is later reviewed by the district attorney's office. They take possession of evidence. They later do interviews of the officers, and they present the case to the district attorney's office, who then makes, they're initially looked at, to be quite honest, as criminal matters. You have to start from that. We later, after the criminal process is played out, then we go look at policies and procedures, but we give deference to that investigation. There are certain rights that a person has when they're under investigation criminally versus employment investigations. We also, I think this is important to the entirety of it, and I realize that we're not talking about police officers right now, but it's in response to your question. My experience, and especially here at the Hillsboro Police Department, is these are extremely traumatic incidents for the officers. And although it breaks my heart that these are often life-changing, they're always life-changing for the officer, they go through this at that point in time. It informs me, while it breaks my heart, that they care. I would never want to have a situation where it was just another day in the office, and I've never experienced that. It's always, even when there isn't a death, it's a transformative experience. But ultimately, getting back to the point is, this is handled in the most objective manner that we find practical, I think is the way I would term it, by working through the prosecuting agency here. After they've rendered a decision, if they render that it's a criminal act, luckily I have not experienced that, but that takes it down an entirely different track, which is the criminal justice system. If it's not a criminal act, our training unit does a very robust analysis, and we're blessed again with Commander Allen and his abilities to bring all of his experience and training to bear on, and literally break it down in the body-worn camera video frame by frame. In our most recent ones, we've sent them out to a third party to do work. I believe one. I don't want to make it sound like multiple, but we've begun to send them out to third parties to try and help us understand what the physical manifestations of the officer's thoughts were, if that makes sense, and try and identify if the officer if it comes to our department, we're not looking at it as a criminal matter anymore. We're looking for it as you've talked about, does it comport with policy and procedure? There is hypothetically a case where the district attorney could choose not to charge, but we find that it doesn't comport with our policy, procedure, and training, and we would take corrective action. That's why we go through all of that. In the end, and part of the officer's process for returning to work, with the assumption that it was deemed a justified use of deadly force, that officer goes through state mandated reintegration training. We put them back in a circumstance that is has the hallmarks of the original circumstance, but is not an exact replica of it. You know, that's where we often find that officers aren't ready to come back to work, or they go through it and we have to give them some more time off. It's multifaceted. It is absolutely for the officer's recovery, but is also to go as far as we can, understanding human fallibilities, to make sure we put an officer out there that's capable to safely perform their duties, doesn't put the public at risk.
Great. I appreciate that answer. Thank you very much. And thank you very much again for being here tonight. And I will also reference one of the protests I went to this weekend, where a student talked about her desire to go home again at the end of the day. And I know that's important for everyone, not only for that student, but for every citizen, not every community member in Hillsboro, and all your officers. I see both sides of that. And so I appreciate your commitment to training and having the right policy and adding the policies and training that we talked about here tonight. So thank you very much. I'm through with my questions.
Thank you, Councilor Pace. Councilor Allen.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think Beach covered a lot, actually, of what I wanted to cover here. I think that we need to have a specific policy for all of the 8 can't wait policies, including the continuum of force. I understand that Hillsboro has a reputation for trying to be innovative, and I understand some of the concerns around why we don't currently have that policy. However, the 8 Can't Wait campaign came out of and they analyzed the top 100 cities in the United States and found that of those that had the continuum of force policy, they were 19% less likely to have officer-related killings. so I think that it is important to explore. I also think that it's going to be an expectation of the public that we implement something like the continuum of force. I personally don't want to be on council someday when, when an officer does something they're not supposed to do. Maybe they use a taser on someone that had jaywalked. I don't know what that's going to be. But, if we don't say it as a council, if we don't make it known as the public that that's where we stand, and we don't train it for our police officers, I don't think we can expect it. So I believe we need to have a policy for all of the 8 can't wait policies that are suggested. I also wanted to say, Commander Allen, you did such a wonderful presentation there. One of the first things that you said is the 3 pillars, right? It was state law, agency policy, and training. And I think I want us to empower ourselves, because 2 of those things, agency policy and training, everybody on the Zoom call has the ability to address. And so we can deal in that realm. And when it comes to state law, if there's something in our way that stops us from being able to address it, we do have, government relations specialists. We can advocate at the state level that those policies be changed. So we have power to affect, if not change outright, in all 3 of those pillars. And so I just want us to be aware.
Good.
Some of the things, Chief Coleman, that you brought up. Oh, do you want to respond to what I said so far?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Yeah, Counselor, thank you. I just also wanted to point out, I wanted to get to the questioning, but, and certainly this is only one aspect of it, but the City of Hillsboro has already instituted a work group at the direction of the city manager. And I would say one of the primary focuses of that work group is for public input, for council input, seeing where other departments overlap with some of the, to help reduce the incidence of where we encounter violent situations, and to report on the progress that we make. So thank you for bringing that up, and it gave me an opportunity to bring that to your attention as well.
Thank you. Another thing that I would say is, in general, I would like us to analyze, just make an effort to reduce the number of police encounters that we have with the public. When I canvassed for my and vast majority of the time, positive things to our police department. When they bring up their concerns, it's usually somebody that was, a person of color that was jogging down the street that maybe was stopped and kind of asked, who they were, what they were doing, and everything. Those kind of interactions, I think that we should find ways to reduce those types of interactions. Another example was a lady that I spoke to that worked in healthcare, who got off late at night from work, took the MAX station downtown, and then walked south to South Hillsboro. And she was complaining that she had been stopped repeatedly by police officers questioning her. And I think that maybe from the officer's standpoint, they were maybe checking in on the person, maybe they're making sure they were safe, maybe they had good intentions, maybe. But I also think that from the public standpoint, we know what officers look like, we know the number for 911, we know how to contact police officers when we need them. And that kind of dynamic with a police officer who's got a firearm, who has authority over you, coming and talking to you, that can be a powerful dynamic. So I just want us to explore how we can avoid those kind of minor interactions.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think that helps everybody. One thing I would add also is we expect our officers to explain why they have stopped and spoken with a citizen, or a community member. So that is an expectation. I realize that, or I'm hearing that we don't meet that expectation all the time, and we need to work harder on that.
Thank you, Chief. And I think along those lines, you had talked about how the officer's full name is listed on their uniform, and I think that's a great step. Add to that, in reading the 21st Century Policing Report, they highlighted certain police departments that will have basically like a business card with the officer's name and badge number information on it. And basically they just hand that card to the person when they start the interaction, so that both people are on equal footing. I don't think that's something that we do currently. Is that something that we could explore doing? Or is there another way to go about making sure that everybody has that information at the time of the interactions beginning?
That's not a current practice, but it's interesting, and I think that's part of being engaged with the public is to get out there and find out what does work for us. And again, that does. We're going to be most successful when we're dealing human being to human being. I would just say that, as we as police officers feel like there's enormous scrutiny on us right now. I've more than once heard people, or, I've even tried to tell people, look, it's a lot of it is a reaction to the uniform that you wear. People haven't met you personally. So if I'm going to tell them that as a mechanism for them to help deal with it, then I have to make serious contemplations about, well, how do we break that down across the board for personnel? How do we get past the uniform? The uniform has deep meaning in this country, and I've always been proud to wear it, but I do think that progress is getting past the barriers that it throws up and getting to that human contact one-to-one.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to shift gears here a little bit. And by the way, I recognize I'm throwing a lot at you and you didn't necessarily prepare to answer all of this. So if you need to get back to me on anything, that's perfectly fine. I was very proud back in 2018 that our police department implemented body-worn cameras. I'm wondering now, do all sworn officers have body-worn cameras, and are they required to turn them on whenever they have interactions with the public?
No, all first responding officers have them, to be most correct, counselor. So our patrol officers, our traffic officers, there's considerations we have to make. For instance, we've talked a lot about school resource officers today, and we have to, the cameras are always passively recording. So we have to give great thought as to where we deploy them. We don't require our detectives to wear them. We feel like, I will own that. I feel like that's a good practice. It focuses on where the bulk of those interactions that we want to capture happen. And in complete transparency, it's an enormous program. It requires an enormous amount of resources of the department. So we want to have them focused on the areas where we have most of the public contact.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's reasonable. I understand there's situations, particularly, if you're in a school and in some of those environments where maybe it's not appropriate. I do think that if it's a budget concern, if we need to buy more cameras, if we need to, buy more data space in the cloud or something like that, I think we should explore that. I think the public's expectation that if they have an encounter with a police officer, that be recorded through body camera, I think that's reasonable. So I'd like us to make that the goal. This is something that obviously has happened on a national scale, so I wanted to make sure that I brought it up. And I'm not talking about through the county, but I'm saying the Hillsboro Police Department. Do we do no-knock warrants? And if we do, is it required that we identify that Hillsboro police are at their door before we come through their door?
So good question, especially they're all good questions. Announcing our presence, unless it's speaking outside the realm of warrants, it's part of when Commander Allen talked about, give a verbal warning if feasible. Sometimes that verbal warning comes at the beginning of the contact when we announce ourselves that we're the police and we're entering into a residence or something like that. For instance, if a door's open, or if we go to a business that has an open, maybe a smashed in front door, we're announcing loudly that we're coming in, that we're the police. We don't want, for instance, an unfortunate encounter with the business owner who may have shown up in the interim and that. So no-knock search warrants are, we don't serve them in Hillsboro. We don't serve them in the county. We really don't serve them in the state of Oregon. A lot of what Commander Allen talked about was the Ninth Circuit, and there's a very high standard here. As a matter of fact, I think it's safe to say Oregon has the highest standard. There are exceptions that we've, to the best of my knowledge, never exercised. For instance, if it's a hostage situation or something just at the very extreme edges of safety, but they're just not. Judges don't even, I don't want to misspeak. I have to always stay on the good side of judges, but in a sense, don't have the authority to sign them here. So it's just not an Oregon phenomena, or at least from my perspective.
Okay. Thank you. And I got two hopefully quick questions. Sorry to take up so much time here. First, I think that it's important that if we're talking about community policing, I think the police need to look like their community. And so in my mind, the goal is that the police department's demographics should match the city's demographics. And so if you agree with that goal, are we working towards that? Do we document our efforts towards that? I know that the police department has done an excellent job compared to other departments at increasing diversity. Would you speak to that for a moment?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we have a long ways to go. We are making progress, but it's going to take incredible effort, maybe even some luck, to self-made luck. Let me put it that way, to get to the goals of really reflecting our community as close as we can. But we are making efforts, and we have a recruiting team, and we're seeing results from that. I think the most rewarding thing there's several rewarding things for me, but I think we attract high quality candidates. We have a reputation, and there's a reason that folks want to come here. We hear regularly from people that they know that we're very open-minded about sexual preference and gender identity. That's literally something that's been shared with us on occasion. That it's an atmosphere where they feel comfortable, but we have a lot of work to do, and this is not blaming. This is just me expressing a concern. It's going to be an exponentially greater challenge now because of what happened in Minneapolis, and I can't change that. I have to fight through it. I have to work through it. I have to help people of diversity understand, or help them, maybe share my experience with them, where I feel like police work is dedication to your community, is a way to serve your community. But I also appreciate at the same time that it's a very big ask of us to ask somebody. They would be subject right now to it'd be a lot of difficulty. I'll just leave it at that way. One last thing. Every person of diversity that has been hired at this police department, at least for the last 5 years, earned it. They would have been hired regardless of what their race was. They earned it. It's about getting the numbers through the door to be in the process. It's not about anything else. They belong here. They make us better. I'm proud to have them here.
Thank you. And just to add to that, I think that one of the ways that we do that is through this process, by having the policies in place, by making the public statements, by making these changes, by showing a culture that this is a place where a police officer really wants to work because they have choices. And so I commend that effort. I want us to stay on top of that. The last thing I'll say is just the stop report. I know that we had a report that came out. Do you know when the next stop report is coming out?
I'll say about a year from the last one. So I think we're about 6 months from when it was released, and I'm sorry that it escapes me. But yeah, there will be another one, and the positive about that is, of course, whenever November, I'm being told. the positive thing about that is, you know, the more years we get, the more we can track, the more validity the numbers have, and the more we can track whether we're making progress or not. And we want the numbers to be deeper. I've spoken with Dr. Sanchagrin from the Criminal Justice Commission, I think 3 to 4 times, and it's just a very high level of analysis, and we are on board with. It's really how we remedy any disparities. Anything without real scientific rigor is a guess, an educated guess, but a guess. We need the scientific rigor to really get to the heart of the matter as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the police department wants and needs to be trusted. And the way that we can make that happen is by being open and transparent and accountable. And when something's not working, we fix it. So thank you for digging deep into that. I look forward to the next report. Hopefully we can show improvement. And over time, I know that you're committed to making that better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Allen. Councilor Nocturnal.
Yeah, I'm still awake. So I couldn't get my unmute to go. Most everything, I'm kind of like Councilor Allen, most everything I wanted to ask has pretty much been covered. I was just going to make a couple of comments if that's okay. I, for what it's worth, and it's really, in my opinion, it's really just that. On the great scheme of things, I think the 8 Can't Wait campaign is really good, but I tend to agree with the chief and with Officer Allen about the continuum of force thing. It's too complicated. It lumps people together, and it's like uniform sentencing. Not every defendant is the same, but they all get the same sentence, right or wrong, because of uniform sentencing rules. And I think the same thing is true. You start lumping together certain kinds of actions that require or allow certain reactions, and they're not all the same. And so, you know, I would disagree with Councilor Allen that we should adopt that one. All the rest of them seem to me that we should adopt, and it seems to me like we're kind of on board towards that end. Would you agree?
Yes, Councilor, we are on board. They're, as I say, they're, you know, I know they're receiving new attention, but they're not new to us, and we've put a lot of thought into it.
Yeah, and it seems to me that one thing that needs to kind of be remembered, I think everybody on council knows, and I don't know whether you know or not, but my degree is in criminal justice, and I was, in my first life, I was a police officer. It seems to me that one of the things that kind of gets lost in the flush of all this stuff is a certain level of understanding that some reactions, both from the police and the public, are emotionally based and not scientifically based. And so some of this stuff sounds really good emotionally, but is not really valid in the street. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think we're all guided by our experiences, and I think we are, I'll just be honest, we are inundated with information, and some of the sources of the information are incredibly competent and convincing, and I don't think their motives are in any way you know, deceitful or negative. I just think there's an arena right now that is highly populated, and a lot of people want to weigh in. They want to feel safe. They want to feel like they have a voice with their police department. So we get it, and we always are extremely appreciative when the conversation's both ways. And you know, I'd like to think that we can offer some evidence that we're listening, and also contribute. I mean, really, this is all about helping the people that live, visit, and work in Hillsboro feel comfortable about seeing a police officer, whether they're on foot, driving down the road. I don't even feel comfortable when they're behind me on the road, but, you know, small victories.
Yeah, yeah, I can relate to that. Well, essentially what I was trying to say is just because everybody thinks it's a good idea doesn't necessarily mean it's obviously going to work in every case on the street. And I'm talking about the continuum of force. I know it's real popular right now. It's sort of what my generation would call the Roy-Tan cigar. You know, everybody needs a good nickel cigar. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's really functional. And so at some level, we need to look at you guys too, to say, you know, this works and this doesn't work, right? Agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Counselor, and I would say that you know, part of our effort, and really sometimes, you know, everybody, like I think the commander talked about, there's a desire to delineate just a myriad of options and circumstances and all that. What we want are people that are functioning on a high level of competency, who can, his example of the 79-year-old protester, that's very important, because I will just be honest, and I'm not speaking of anybody I'm working now, but that can be a crutch. You know, it says I can do this. We don't want that circumstance.
Right.
We want people who understand what is meant by the important legal terms that are applicable in our country right now, one of them being objective reasonableness.
Right. And yeah. When I first started as a police officer, Oregon law allowed you to shoot any fleeing felon. But, you know, you didn't really want to hire guys who were going to do that. And I think you're talking about the same thing here. The other thing I was going to say, in the 70s, when I was hired on, we all had business cards with our name on it and everything. It said the sheriff's name, and then it showed us as a deputy, and we handed them out to everybody every time we had a stop or anything. I'm just kind of echoing the comment that was made by Kyle. It seemed to be a real good PR thing, for whatever it's worth. And about diversity, you know, I know we've worked at it a lot, and Councilor Allen spoke about it, but how do you encourage people from diverse backgrounds to come to work? I don't know. How do you do that? What do you do? I mean, our population is half women. We don't have half women on the department. Our population is 20% or 30% or 40%, depending on how you lump them together. Minorities, we don't have that many on the department. So what do you do to try to bring those people on board, and how difficult is that? I happen to know that at the sheriff's office, they have a devil of time filling up the necessary women just to run the jail, simply because the physical requirements of the job are not necessarily within all women's grasp for upper body strength. So what do you do to make this happen and not lower your standards?
Well, I'll write the book when I figure it out. But it is about dialogue with those communities of color. I mean, we have to make them feel like, we have to help them see that there's an opportunity there, really, I think, is what it's about. You know, and a lot of times in past lives, we've talked about benefits and pay, and you know, it's a good job in a lot of those circumstances, but I think now we need to speak more to the heart.
Yeah, right.
And we need to talk about the opportunities in that manner. You know, in a lot of circumstances, we're still in the mode of where a person of color being a police officer, they're a pioneer. They are. It is historically, and we've talked a lot about history tonight, a white male dominated field, even one where you had to be 6 foot in a lot of places beforehand. So we are trying to break through that. And it's about, they will perform when you get them here, if there are somebody who we want in our community doing this job. They are there, we will find them. What we have to do is, you know, help them see those opportunities, get the numbers through the door so the odds of success are higher. women, that's exactly what's happening with women at the Hill. Not what's happening, has happened with women at the Hillsboro Police Department. Is they see other women working here. They see women leading women and men and leading in important roles.
Right.
They've risen to the top of this organization, and we have more on the way. And so that's, you know, in a lot of ways, maybe that is part of the answer for people of other diversity and backgrounds.
I have just one last question. It's about this duty to intervene, which I support wholeheartedly. But how do you? Is there a plan, or how do you deal with an officer who feels that they need to intervene and they do, and somebody maybe higher up on the command chain thinks that was not necessary, and now you've got this whistleblowing problem that happens in regular private industry? Do you have that same kind of situation? You facing that same thing in the department? I've wondered about this for some time.
Yeah. I think very highly of our department, but I am biased. There are no two ways about it. I will tell you that is a problem in the profession, absolutely, unequivocally. But we have concentrated heavily on leadership here. And when I go to the field and work with the officers, I don't work with them. They usually cart me around, and I just try and stay out of the way. But they're debriefing calls after they're concluded. They're talking about what could we have done better. And when I talked early on about culture and attitude being the way you stop excessive force, thank you, but that is exactly what I'm talking to. It's the culture, it's the attitude, it would be what was absent in Minneapolis, if I could be just kind of very out there. Your stomach needs to turn under those circumstances. You need to be physically revolted and called into action under those circumstances. It's just, and I believe we are not perfect. I am not saying that, but I do not believe our culture comports with what happened there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councilor Bender.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Chief Coleman, and to your staff and leadership. I've got every confidence in your ability to lead our department and what you've implemented thus far. I kind of want to put this, and a lot of my specific questions about police practices and reform have been answered by the inquiries of other counselors. So I'll set that aside for a moment and just offer a few comments. One is that I think this discussion needs to happen in the context of the systemic racism, the history of our country, and dealing with race, and what's called for now, especially from those of us that are white and privileged, because what I heard at these rallies, and I've been to them, is a lot of pain from people that are suffering from discrimination of one sort or another, mistreatment of one sort or another, not merely confined to the police department and their actions and interactions with our community, but from the community more broadly. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of our DEI work that I think a lot of people are unaware of at the city, and bringing that out to the community. I think that'll help. I think what I'm understanding is called for in some of the discussions I've had with people is, can we reimagine our approach to community safety? And what I'm saying is, we've tasked our police force with everything from dealing with mental health issues to substance abuse problems to homelessness to incidents of all sorts of things that that I think are, it's so much. Can we offload some of that in a win-win type of approach to people that are outside of uniform but have maybe a better chance of engaging with the public in a more friendly way that isn't fraught with all the context of the uniform and the police and what they see in other communities and mistrust and that sort of thing. So I guess I'm viewing this as the part of the initiation of a conversation with our community and with our council. It's a process. Change is really hard, but I think what we're seeing, if I'm looking at it even globally, is a real sea change in the way people want to deal with criminal justice, and not just confined to our police department, but I'm talking about the whole justice system. So I think we need to scope out and look at the broader context of this whole discussion. And that's all I'll say. Oh, I was going to say, Eugene has a kind of a unique approach, and I know it's gotten a lot of publicity lately in terms of delegating some of that responsibility to maybe non-uniform people and so forth. So maybe you can comment on that. But what I want to realize, we're all responsible for this. You know, it's not just our police department. In fact, they're ahead of the game. We're ahead of the game. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. I think the program you're referring to in Eugene is called Cahoots.
That's correct.
Yeah. I have spoken with the police administration down there, just trying to understand how it operates. I have some experience in a previous life with Volunteers of America, who pick up intoxicated individuals and have sobering stations. And part of the process is to try and get them into treatment. So programs like that, another very popular conversation right now is moving funds away from law enforcement and putting them into some of these social service avenues. And I just want to make I think that's an end. That we got to work on the means of that. And you won't get too many police officers who are going to miss going to, a domestic disturbance that hasn't risen above raised voices. You're not going to get too many who are going to miss being first responders. And I think this is what you're talking about. First responders on homelessness, and even more troubling, first responders on mental health and addiction. Those are chronic issues that law enforcement isn't just the safety net, it's the entire net, at least initially, to get them into the system. For instance, I do not know what the number is, but a great deal of addiction treatment in this country only gets initiated because an individual is arrested and goes into the criminal justice system. That needs to be fixed. That needs to be fixed. All I would ask that folks consider when they make a serious move in that direction is understanding that if there isn't a well-planned handoff, and we're talking years to build up the infrastructure, it takes 4 years to get a social work degree. I hope people realize that, unless there's some other change to that, that there's a handoff, that we put all the investment in infrastructure and training and development on the front end. Otherwise, if there's a gap, if we defund police tomorrow and then say we want to build up these other things, Jim Coleman's personal opinion, human tragedy. There are people out there who will be greatly affected by it. So we're ready to build the team, to have a bigger team. Absolutely. There are a lot of things we ask police to be the first responders on now. We have great partnerships in the mental health arena, in the criminal justice system, in community outreach, including private entities. We're all about that.
Well, that's great. Just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting we defund our police department. So
My words, not yours. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks. I appreciate that. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I know we have a new police station envisioned, and I wonder if we should revisit the idea of maybe something more embedded in the community, like a precinct concept, or a more friendly, engaging police headquarters. You see what I'm saying? As I think that's kind of what people are advocating for, is less of a what might be called a militaristic approach. You know what I mean? So yeah.
Less of a fortress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah.
One of the best.
I mean, some of that's necessary.
One of the best parts of my job is I get to listen to architects and designers talk about how they make things like that happen. So yeah, we want to be innovative, and that's an enormous community investment in itself. So why not take the opportunity to do something transformative?
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Van Biveren. Councilor Alcare, you have a comment.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments that have been made. I want to talk what you talked about. You want to diversify the police, and that there's a struggle, right? And I just want to mention that you can want to hire diverse people as much as you want, but if you don't have an infrastructure within the police department to manage what happens to those folks when things don't go right on the job, when the work environment has to be inclusive and welcoming for all people. And so if that isn't there, people are going to have a hard time staying and doing their job, plus being, their ethnicity, right? Because I would expect, like, if you're thinking that you would hire Spanish-speaking cops, that they would be interacting with Spanish-speaking community, correct? So I think that it's not enough just to find a match, but you talked about really getting at the heart of this. And what's happening is the context of all these policies and best practices that are there aren't necessarily jiving with the transformational, the anger people feel, the pain people feel. It doesn't respond to that very well. And so I just want to say that it's not just enough to have diverse people. You have to have a system that is welcoming and wants to support diverse people on police force. And I think that sometimes if people don't want to speak up, it's out of fear. And so that just perpetuates an inability of somebody of color to want to speak up and say, I think that we should change this, and I think we should try looking at this. So I would encourage you to really dig down deep and why you even want people of color serving on the police force and what benefit it does for this city through the police department. The second thing I do want to say is that I'm hearing a lot more conversation about defunding. And I think before we decide that we can't do that, I think we should really explore why we can't do that and not just say so out of fear. When I think about if we pull cultural resource officers out of the schools, can we put social workers, licensed social workers in? Or maybe people who can facilitate those conversations that a 5-year-old would have with their teacher about why you shouldn't be calling me this name. So I really want to encourage us not to be afraid to look at what that could be like. Because whether or not we're sitting here and we feel comfortable with what we want, it's out in the public who are going to demand these changes if they really feel we need to have them. So they're going to come. They're going to want to have those things. I don't think we should be afraid. We'll find out more about how we are as a system and a city, I think, going through that process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Alcare. Commander Allen and Chief, thank you. I recognize that it's closing in on 9. Fortunately, most of my things have also been addressed. But one thing I'd like to ask, because I do recognize that there's systemic racism and institutional racism that goes back generations, not just in Hillsboro, but obviously in our state as well as our country. And so one of the things, I'd like, to know is what, within our city, there's things that we're doing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, to address, some of the systemic racism and, just within the police culture, or, are there things then that are, I guess, measures that are being taken? Along those lines and tying into that would be a second question, where you mentioned, Chief, that, Hillsboro is an attractive destination for officers. So how do we know that when there are officers who come here, and this is a question that I've received a couple of times, how do we know when they have resigned from other, departments, that we are not getting officers who, kind of had a separation agreement with their previous agency, where, they won't speak poorly of performance and behavior, moving forward. And so how do we weed out, those potential bad apples? How do we, make sure that we have officers who don't come in, with, white supremacy types of attitudes and predisposition. So that's kind of an accumulation of several questions that I've received from our public.
Sure. If I could start with the second one, and you might have to remind me of the first one, but I think I've got it in the end. Yeah, we typically, we wish we had a lot more candidates. A lot of it is out of our control with economics and things such as that. But we do attract candidates from outside the department, people who've had experience in other places within Oregon and then in other places within the United States. And we've actually, we're broadening our reach there, and we've had some people from as far away as the Midwest come out. And before that, we've got a couple of folks from Hawaii here as well. So when people look to move to the Northwest, we benefit from the attractiveness of Hillsboro. And if they're engaged in law enforcement, that's a real magnet for them to come here and have this lifestyle. We probably have above a 90% washout rate when we from the moment you apply to the time you're selected as an officer. They go through multiple interview panels. They have to fill out things, statements of personal history, and we have invested heavily, literally with money and resources, to train our officers to do pre-employment background checks. And we, when occasion presents itself, we send them to the applicants. When they get to those final stages where we would go through a background check, we get to the applicant's current place of residence, wherever that is. To kind of cut to the chase, we require that they fill out that statement of personal history and sign a disclosure agreement. And before they're hired, again, that rigorous background, they go through a psychological test also to see their suitability for the job. But in that, I want to mention this because I think, it's the aspect of follow through on that. We have let go of individuals who were not honest with us on their statement of personal history, who did not present us with their full employment background. So we just won't even go through the motions if they won't give us that permission. So that is how we try and not inherit somebody else's problem. And we have no interest in it. That's one place where we don't give grace. We can be selective. We're highly selective under those circumstances, and we don't have we just don't have the time to try and change somebody who has already demonstrated certain lacks of proficiency, for lack of a better term. How do we weed out racism in our workplace?
And I'll also throw out for some things like, training, bias training and those sorts of things as well. So what are some of the things that you do to, support those, those efforts in our department?
Yeah. It is part of the engagement that we talked about earlier. And I know that, in some ways we really do rely on the city to help us. Anytime you have a closed system where you look at yourself and you try to decide how you're doing on something, you're only getting part of the picture. And I have to say that the city's equity team and their efforts in DEI have, we've had really intense participation by some of our employees here, to the point of it's had impact on their personal relationships, and they've had to navigate that. That to me tells me that there's important dialogue happening, and that they can bring that back to the police department. I will tell you, in the current circumstance, we have tried to, the chief tries to capture the voice of the department from time to time, and that I haven't always satisfied every voice in the department, and there's people that want us to do more, and those are the voices that we have to pay attention to and try and understand. There's times when we speak as a community, and there's times when we speak as individuals. So I think it's an area where really we need help. And it's about the biggest thing we can bring to the table is the openness to the help.
Yeah.
As Councilor Alcar said, is intentions are wonderful, but are there systems in place that the best of intentions just can't get over that hurdle? And there's things we're going to hear that tell us we have to do things from an entirely different perspective than we have before. And the only thing that police hate more than change or no change is change. So, and myself included at times in my career. So, I know that answer probably in some corners begs more specifics, but I think we really do have to look at the way we have to have an open ear to things that maybe in the past we were just dismissive of.
Thank you, and I appreciate the candor with the answer, and I think that this is just the beginning of our community conversations as we begin to receive questions and pass them on and hear these answers. Another thing is we hear about defunding, and so if and I know there were times as a principal, we would have DHS reports that we would make, but they would send police officers, and so if we were to decouple or unbundle, if you will, some of the calls that we require police officers to go on now. For instance, with DHS, what does that look like for the workload of our officers, and then what would it take, I guess, then for whether it's the county to pick up the mental health as they provide, public health and mental health services to the county. If we didn't provide those, what would that, what would that do for, and some of that's a bit speculative, but what would that hand off then to the county to have to deal with? What would that hand off or hand back to DHS to deal with?
Yeah, and so in beginning to try and answer that question, Mr. Mayor, first of all, I have enormous respect for our partners. We couldn't save lives. We couldn't talk people. We couldn't give people hope when they think they've gotten to the end of all hope. If we didn't have some fantastic professionals working with us to get people to that help. And I do think that there are amazing things happening there, and it's some of the best experiences we have as police officers, although the day in and day out can be enormously discouraging. But the current system is to respond to these situations where they're happening. And I have a hard time contemplating that particular approach from going away. So you have to equip a lot of those services that are stationary to now go the places police officers go, homes, the street, the transit system, the woods behind the parks, the bus stop benches. That's where they would have to go. That's a sea change in those circumstances. You asked what would the impact be on the police department? It'd be enormous. We would definitely be in a different line of work. As far as, there would be, some focus probably actually on only the most violent or dangerous of situations. So, that's a whole nother discussion that could be had. But I would tell you one anecdote is, again, under the current system, and there are some creative people. We got here for a reason. I'm sure we can get out with some good reasons. But DHS right now sends our police department 1,400 cases a year. They did 1,472, I think was the number for 2019 cases. Here's the easy part. If they worked 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, that would reduce some of them. But the majority of them are what we would call immediate response, or they're just not cases that DHS is equipped to go out there and do in a safe manner without the accompaniment of a police officer. 1,400. That's we struggle regularly at the police department to even handle them ourselves. So this is a big conversation. These are big numbers. These are big movements in the way society is. So I hope that was responsive.
So then why does DHS, because they're staffed, why does DHS, because that's a huge number, why do they pass that on to our police department, recognizing that, probably a commensurate or proportional number are being passed on to, police departments, throughout the cities in our county?
Oh, why do they pass it on?
Yes.
The immediacy of some of them, that they can't get there given, it's not just their schedule, it's their resources. So,
Okay.
I mean, that's a resource shift. You'd have to really give them, I think an operation like DHS would have to start looking like the size of police departments in Hillsboro, not the whole state or the whole county, in Hillsboro. So some of it is, a lot of it is the resources, but there are absolutely, it's a combination of the danger, the need for immediate response, and I would say the expertise of the response. They have a skill set, we have a skill set, and when we get to the most horrific of circumstances, it's our skill set that makes a difference for children.
Very good. Thank you. And I'm assuming too that some of the calls that come in are after hours, weekends and those sorts of things when there are no DHS workers. Therefore, it by default also becomes a responsibility of a police department.
Yes, sir.
Okay. A couple of other things, Chief, that have come up, and I know this came up several years ago, but just to, I guess, confirm, Hillsboro's never been a part of, or, the military, surplus program. We see evidence around the country, of militarization of police forces, but we don't have any military vehicles, surplus military vehicles, or and we're not a part of that program for any other military surplus equipment. Correct?
We do not have any equipment from that program. I struggle to think of what you would describe as militaristic or militarization. That's a person's what they see. But from my perspective, all of our stuff is law enforcement by nature, and we do not participate in the 1033 program, right, which you're referencing, nor have we.
Thank you. And then just one last thing related, I'm sorry, I think my signal has gotten weak here, having to do with our new mobile command unit. That is specifically just a communication center, nothing that has offensive, capability or anything like that.
Yeah, really, I struggle to think of any, certainly none of our police vehicles have offensive capabilities, and that certainly doesn't. It is a platform to really, most importantly, back up our communications network, which is the number one challenge in the face of a natural disaster or even a man-made disaster. So it is the backbone of our plan for communications in the event of a disaster. It's really, and it's the crux of how we would serve the community in a situation that where public utilities were cut off, where life rescue operations had to be operated out of. Now, we deploy it. It certainly, that's hopefully a once in a lifetime occurrence. But we do deploy it regularly. It's a brand new asset, so I'd be making mistakes by talking about percentages, but it's intended to be as much for community outreach and support as it is for these communications and planning operations that it would have. We have used it on a couple of homicide investigations to keep our, not only to keep our employees out of the weather, which would be, I agree, you can do that with an umbrella, but to bring all the technology to the area, to begin to write search warrants if necessary, to begin to call in additional resources to maintain security. It's multifaceted. It is absolutely, it has no offensive capabilities. Yeah, right. It is not military in any manner other than the military relies on communications as well.
Very good. Thank you. And, I guess just recognizing the lateness, I do appreciate your patience with us as we ask questions from our community and bring issues forward. And I will ask if there's any other comments or questions from any of the counselors before we wrap it up. All right, seeing and hearing none. I appreciate again tonight very much and I look forward to moving forward. As we look forward, one of the things we talk about public input, improvements to other city departments, reports on the progress, and and those are absolutely critical things that we will act upon, moving forward. I'm grateful for the work that has already been occurring, so that we are starting ahead of some of the other departments. And I think that shows, truly the desire for meaningful change, because that's already part of the processes in place. Again, thank you for that. We look forward to our next steps, our next community conversations as well. So with that, I'll ask Simone if she has anything that she would like to say, to wrap this up as our city manager for tonight. And if not, then we will go ahead and adjourn.
Thank you, Mayor. I would just say thank you to Detective Castro, Commander Allen, and to Chief Coleman for putting together this work session. Appreciate the thoroughness that you showed here, and clearly Council had a lot of questions. I'm glad you were able to answer those. I think we received some charges there not charges, sorry, crime, police. We received some encouragement to examine some of the policies that we have and the practices, and I think those are all fair. Robbie, our city manager, tasked us with forming an internal work group to work with PD and across the organization, with council, with community, most importantly, and staff, to understand where we can make improvements and where we can be responsive. And so we will face some challenges as we go through that, but our goal is to listen to community and make sure that we understand thoroughly where there are areas that we can make adjustments and address community concerns. To everyone's point earlier, we know in this country there is historic racism. It is systemic and institutional, and that's just something that we'll have to continue to confront. I know the City Council has done their work helping to, by adopting the equity statement resolution, and that's a start. We will continue training at a high level of the organization as well as with council. Some of that has been put on hold through COVID-19, but we look forward to renewing those efforts. Our senior leadership team started back up just yesterday. So we are looking forward to this challenge. We have a community that needs us, and we know our police department is there to serve and always has been, and we just appreciate all of your efforts, and council, as always, we appreciate the work that you do.